7,687,675. That is the number stamped on the last car. It came off the line at Elizabeth, South Australia at 11:15 in the morning on the 20th of October 2017. This is not the story of Holden. Holden was only the last one to switch the lights off. Ford had gone the year before. Toyota went 17 days earlier. And behind them went something like 260 component businesses that most Australians have never heard of. Now, one correction straight away, because you will be told a United Nations declaration signed in Peru did this. It did not. The tariff wall started coming down 20 months before that declaration existed, and it came down here by our own hand. This industry was built as a defence asset, kept alive as a jobs program, and killed as a budget line. Before we go any further, if you want to keep these stories alive, I've created a book with the complete Australian lost factories. The workers, the gates, the Australian made, all gone. The link is on the first line of the description. Back to the story. Chapter 1. The Arsenal. Australia went into the Second World War unable to make its own weapons. Not short of them, unable to make them. The country could produce wool and wheat and iron ore, and it could assemble somebody else's designs under license. But the machine tools, the precision engineering, the capacity to turn a drawing into a working gun, largely did not exist here. On the 11th of June, 1940, the government made a man named Essington Lewis the Director General of Munitions, and gave him extraordinary powers over Australian industry. Lewis ran BHP. He had visited Japan in 1934, watched what its industry was doing, come home and told anybody who would listen that a war was coming and that Australia could not fight one. Almost nobody listened. When the job finally came, he took it on top of running BHP, and he took no salary for it. What he built in 4 years is one of the least celebrated achievements in this country's history. By 1943, the munitions industry employed something in the order of 60,000 people, and more than half of them were women. Australia produced over 700 aircraft, 60 naval vessels, millions of rounds of ammunition, and a locally designed tank. Bren gun carriers came out of factories that had been making car bodies. And at Fisherman's Bend, on the Yarra in Melbourne, they built Bristol Beaufort torpedo bombers, with the parts subcontracted out to around 600 suppliers, including the state railway workshops. Hold on to Fisherman's Bend. It comes back in about 4 minutes. Consider what that actually required. In 1939, there was no machine tool industry in Australia worth the name. To build an aircraft, you first have to build the jigs. To build the jigs, you have to build the tools that cut them. And to do any of it, you need thousands of people who have never done precision work in their lives to learn it in months. That is what those 4 years were, not a factory being switched on, but a country teaching itself a trade under pressure. Then, on the 15th of February 1942, Singapore fell. John Curtin called it Australia's Dunkirk, the opening of the Battle of Australia. And the lesson every man in Canberra took out of it was the same one. When the shipping lanes are threatened, a country that cannot make things cannot defend itself. Everything you need has to already be here. So in 1944, with the war still running, the government wrote to the motor manufacturers and asked them to build an all-Australian car. The man who assessed the responses was the Secretary of the Department of Munitions, John Jensen. He looked at what General Motors Holden had done through 4 years of war production and concluded that it was, in his words, the firm for the job. 5 companies answered that letter. The one that won it was the one that asked for the least. Chapter 2. She's a Beauty. The 5 were Nuffield, Standard Triumph, Chrysler, General Motors Holden and Ford. Ford's proposal was the one Cabinet actually liked. A full V8 line, ambitious, comprehensive, and it lost because it asked for more government money and left more risk sitting on the Commonwealth's books. General Motors Holden won by asking for less. There was still a problem, and the problem was in Detroit, a market of 7 million people at the far end of the world, and a Labor government that owned the railways and the telephones and had just spent 4 years directing private industry. Sloane's instinct was no. Ben Chifley arranged a government loan of £2.5 million, and Sloane came round. Which brings us to the Australian in this story who lost his argument and is barely remembered for it. Lawrence Hartnett was managing director of General Motors Holden, and he wanted the car designed here by Australians for Australian conditions. Detroit insisted on an American design. What they eventually settled on was a small Chevrolet body that the Americans had already rejected as too small for their own market. Hartnett fought it, and Hartnett lost. He was out of the company by December 1946, 2 years before the car he had spent a decade arguing for came off the line. At 2:30 in the afternoon on Monday, the 29th of November 1948, in the social hall at Fisherman's Bend, the same ground where they had built the Beauforts, about 1,200 invited guests watched the first Holden roll out. The Prime Minister looked at it and reportedly said, "She's a beauty." That is the line everybody remembers. The line that matters more came a minute later, when Chifley explained why the government had done any of this. The war, he said, had driven home to the government that Australia should be self-supporting in regard to transport during a time of national crisis. Not jobs, not exports, not national pride. Defence. There is something worth noticing in that sentence. The reason the Commonwealth of Australia put its money into a motor car had almost nothing to do with motor cars. It had to do with the 4 years that had just finished and the possibility of another 4 like them, and the memory of a country that could not make what it needed. The car cost £675 plus 10% sales tax, which was around 2 years of an average wage. 18,000 people had already put a deposit down on one without having seen it. And a correction here, because it is the single most corrected fact about this car. It was the 48-215. That is what it was called. It was not the FJ. The FJ came 5 years later, in 1953, and it was a facelift. And the FX name was not on the car either. It appears to have been penciled into a General Motors Holden drawing office around 1952 to distinguish the early cars from the ones with the new front suspension. Nobody standing in that hall in 1948 called it anything but the Holden. They built 120,000 of them, and everyone was counted because in 1948 somebody was counting. 7.5 million cars later, nobody was, and the whole thing stood behind a wall. Chapter 3. The Wall. Australia did not grow a car industry. Australia legislated one. From the First World War, the country had taxed imported car bodies, partly to save shipping space and partly to protect the coach builders who made them. The Green Tariff of 1922 made that permanent, and it is the entire reason for what follows. Consider Holden. The firm began in Adelaide in 1856 as a saddlery, harness and leather. It moved into upholstery, then into motor body building, because a law said that if you wanted to sell a car in this country, somebody here had to make the body. Then the Depression nearly finished it. Holden's output collapsed from about 34,000 units in 1930 to 1,651 in 1931. General Motors bought the company out of that wreckage in 1931. Ford had come to Geelong in 1925, putting Model Ts together beside the bay. The plant sat on the waterfront because the parts came in by ship. Assembly later moved north to Broadmeadows, but Ford stayed in Geelong for 91 years, casting engines there until the very last day. And Geelong was a Ford town the way Elizabeth would become a Holden town, one employer, and a whole community's arrangements built around a whistle. Chrysler set up in Adelaide. Toyota and Nissan came later, in the 1960s, and built here for the same reason everybody else did, which was that the tariff made it cheaper than shipping finished cars in. There is a detail in that Holden story worth holding on to. The firm that would build 7.5 million Australian cars began by making harness for horses, and it survived into the motor age only because a tariff made it illegal to import a finished car body. Every single thing that follows, the Monaro, Bathurst, the Commodore, in your father's driveway, traces back to a line in a customs schedule. By the early 1980s, the tariff wall on cars stood at around 57.5%. Behind it sat 5 manufacturers, Holden, Ford, Chrysler, Toyota and Nissan, building 13 separate models for a country of 15 million people. Say that plainly, because everything after it follows from it. No market of 15 million people supports 5 car companies. It never did, and it never could. Modern car manufacturing needs something like 250,000 units a year out of a single plant to make sense. Australia was splitting a fraction of that 5 ways. The wall was not protecting an industry that had grown up strong. It was holding one upright. It is easy to be sneering about that in hindsight, and it would be wrong. Every country that built cars in the 20th century did it behind some kind of wall: Japan, Korea, France, Britain, the United States. Protection was not an Australian eccentricity. It was the entry fee. The question was never whether to have a wall. It was what you did with the time the wall bought you. And for 30 years, standing behind it, Australians built things that nobody else in the world was building. Chapter 4. Kangaroo Chaser. Sometime around 1932 or 1933, a farmer's wife in Gippsland sat down and wrote a letter to Hubert French, the managing director of Ford Australia. Her problem was that her family owned one vehicle. What she wanted was something she could drive to church on a Sunday and take the pigs to market in on a Monday. The letter went to a designer at Geelong named Lou Bant. Bant was 22 years old. What he drew was a car at the front and a tray at the back, built as one piece rather than a car with a box bolted on, and it went on sale in 1934. It was the first coupe utility in the world. The Ute. Detroit was unimpressed. Henry Ford is said to have looked at photographs of it and called it a kangaroo chaser. There is a coda to that story. On the 18th of March 1987, Lou Bant was driving home from filming a documentary about his own invention, and he died on that drive. He was in a 1934 Ute. That is the whole character of this industry in one anecdote. The best idea anybody in it ever had came from a customer nobody had asked, was executed by a 22-year-old and was dismissed by the head office in Detroit as a novelty for a strange country. Every utility on every road in Australia today descends from that letter. The pattern held for 50 years. Australia kept building things for Australian conditions that made no sense anywhere else, and they were superb. In 1960, Robert Menzies opened Ford's new plant at Broadmeadows, and the Falcon came out of it. It had started as an American compact, and it diverged almost immediately into something longer, tougher and better sprung, because the roads here would destroy the American one. At Holden, an engineer named Ed Selines drew the red motor, a 6-cylinder designed around the size of an Australian car, rather than adapted down from an American one. Then the muscle cars, the Monaro, the Tirana, the Valiant Charger. In 1972, a newspaper campaign about a 160-mile-per-hour road car killed the Falcon GT HO Phase 4 before it ever reached a showroom. A handful had already been built. They are among the most valuable Australian cars in existence. And every October the whole thing went to Bathurst, and a country of 8 million adults divided itself into Ford families and Holden families the way it divided into Labor and Liberal. Look at what these places actually were. Broadmeadows on the northern edge of Melbourne, Geelong on the bay, Altona, which today makes hydrogen, Tonsley in Adelaide, which today is a university precinct with more people in it than Mitsubishi employed at the end. And Elizabeth in South Australia, not a suburb that grew, but a town laid out on purpose in the 1950s for British and Scottish migrants, planned around the plant that was going to employ them. A boy called Jimmy Barnes grew up in it, and Fisherman's Bend, where the Beauforts had been built, and where the first Holden came out, and which is today owned by the University of Melbourne. What all of those places have in common is that none of them existed as industrial towns before somebody decided the country needed to build cars. They were made on purpose, by policy, in a generation. The Commodore was the best-selling car in Australia for 15 years in a row, so walk through the gate at Elizabeth on a morning in 1970. Chapter 5. The Shift. It is 10 to 6 in the morning, and the car park is already most of the way full. Look at what is parked in it. Kingswoods, Toranas, a few Falcons belonging to men who will hear about it all day. Nearly everything in that car park was built inside this building, by the people getting out of them. Inside, the line is not started yet, and the building sounds enormous. Concrete and steel roof, and the noise of a few hundred people talking in a space built for machines. Then it starts, and for about 10 minutes it is deafening. Presses, conveyor, the compressed air hiss of the guns. And by 9 o'clock you have stopped hearing it entirely, and if it stopped you would look up immediately, because silence in here means something has gone wrong. The smell is hot metal and paint and cutting oil, and it gets into your clothes, and your wife knows what shift you are on by what the laundry smells like. There is a canteen and there is a smoko room, and there is a hierarchy in both that has nothing to do with anybody's job title. Men who came out from Glasgow in 1958 sit with men who came out from Glasgow in 1958. The Italians have their own table and better food. The man on the station next to you has been doing that job for 11 years. He does not look at his hands. He looks down the line at what is coming. A car comes past every 90 seconds. 90 seconds is not very long. It is long enough to do 4 things properly and no time at all to fix a mistake. And you learn to feel the rhythm of it in your body, the way you feel a song. There are 4 languages on this line. Men from Britain and Scotland and Italy and Greece who came out on assisted passages and were housed in a town built for them a mile away. Somewhere in this building there is a man whose entire job is to drive finished cars 20 metres and park them. Somewhere else there is an apprentice who got the start because his father works in the paint shop, which is how most people in this building got the start. At the end of the shift, the whistle goes, and it goes over the town as well, and there are households out there setting their evening by it. And the cars go out the gate onto trucks to a country that is buying every single one you can build. Nobody on that line is counting them. Somewhere in a ledger in an office upstairs, the running total is ticking past 2 million, on its way to 7.5, and not one person on the floor could tell you what it is. Why would you? Chapter 6. The 18th of July. At 7 o'clock in the evening on the 18th of July, 1973, Garth Whitlam went on national television and announced a 25% cut to every import tariff in the country, effective at midnight. The minister responsible was Jim Cairns in Overseas Trade and Secondary Industry. The decision had been made in about 3 weeks by a small committee, with the affected industries given no warning at all. The intention was to fight inflation, let cheaper goods in and prices come down. The financial press at this time called it one of the boldest economic reforms since Federation. General Motors Holden laid off 5,000 people, and there was a political crisis, and tariffs were partly restored the following year. Now, the myth, because it is the single most repeated explanation for everything in this story, and it is wrong. You will be told that Australia went to a United Nations conference in Peru and agreed to shut down its own manufacturing and hand it to developing countries. That the Lima Declaration required this country to cut its industry by 30%. that everything since has been the execution of that agreement. Here are the facts. The Lima Declaration was adopted on the 26th of March, 1975. Australia voted for it. The United States was the only country that voted against it. It was never signed and never ratified, because it was not a treaty. It was a declaration of aspirations, and the operative word throughout the text is should, not shall. It set a goal that developing countries might reach a quarter of world industrial production by the year 2000. It bound nobody to anything, and no legal authority has ever found otherwise. And then there is the arithmetic, which finishes it. Whitlam cut the tariffs on the 18th of July, 1973. Lima was March 1975. The wall started coming down 20 months before the declaration existed. It is worth understanding why the myth is so persistent, because the people who believe it are not fools. They watched an industry disappear, and they were never given a satisfying reason for it. A signed agreement in a foreign capital is a better story than 30 years of incremental decisions by ministers of both parties, most of them announced on a Tuesday and forgotten by Thursday. The true version is harder, and it is more Australian than the myth. Nobody in Peru did this. Our own elected government started lowering the wall in 1973, and both sides of politics kept lowering it for the next 30 years, and every one of them said so out loud at the time. 11 years after Whitlam, a minister decided that the only way to save the industry was to make it smaller. Chapter 7. The Button Plan. Senator John Button was the federal industry minister, and he was not a car man. He was an arithmetic man. His argument was direct, and it was correct. The industry was too big for the market it was serving. Better a small slice of a large pie than a large slice of a small one. The Motor Industry Development Plan, which everybody called the Button Plan, was announced in mid-1984 and took effect in 1985. 13 locally built models were to be cut to 6, 5 manufacturers were to be consolidated toward 3 groups, and the tariff would come down 2.5 percentage points a year from 1988 until it reached 15% by the year 2000, well below what comparable countries were charging. Button flew to Japan himself to tell Toyota and Nissan what was about to happen. The problem was that to reach the volumes the plan required, the manufacturers could not do it alone. They had to share. The mechanism was badge engineering. 1 car, 2 badges, 2 price lists. The Holden Apollo was a Toyota Camry. The Holden Nova was a Toyota Corolla. The Toyota Lexen was a Holden Commodore with different tail lights and a new name. And there is one scene from inside that arrangement that tells you everything about it. Holden's design director, Philip Zmood, and Nissan's chief designer, Paul Berenger, had to work out how to make the same car look different enough to justify selling it twice. Their head offices would not fund real differentiation. So they met, in Berenger's own words, clandestinely in a Port Melbourne pub under the cloak of darkness and smoke, to agree between themselves what each company would be allowed to change, and notice what badge engineering actually spent. Ford and Holden had spent 60 years building the 2 most recognisable names in Australian life, at enormous cost, in advertising and at Bathurst, and in family loyalty handed from father to son. The plan required them to lend those names to somebody else's car in order to hit a production number. The brand equity was real capital, and it was drawn down to fund a policy. Buyers were not fooled. The industry estimate, repeated for 40 years, is that the donor outsold the clone by about 7-1. 2 things should be said in fairness. It did not always run that way. The Holden Barina outsold the Suzuki it was based on, because the advertising was better known than the donor. And John Button was right about the central problem. 13 models for 15 million people was madness, and he never resiled from the plan. In his last interviews before he died in 2008, He defended it and said that what he set out to do was reduce it to a sizable industry, and that it worked. What the plan needed in order to work was exports, and the decisions about exports were not made in Australia. Chapter 8. The Veto. Every car company in Australia answered to a head office somewhere else, and every head office had its own factories to protect. Ian Vaughan was Vice President of Product Development at Ford Australia. In the 1980s, he went to Detroit with a proposal: build a left-hand drive Falcon and put the Falcon and the Fairlane into the Middle East in place of the Crown Victoria and the Taurus. Exactly what General Motors was already doing with Holden's Commodore and Caprice. He said afterwards, in an interview in 2016, "Unfortunately, I did not succeed. That would have perhaps opened some doors to make Falcon into a global platform." 20 years later, they tried again. Ford Australia pitched a left-hand drive Falcon to the United States as a police car to replace the Crown Victoria in 2005 and again in 2009. The projected volume was more than 70,000 a year, which executives said would have secured the plant for 2 decades. Dearborn chose the Taurus, and here is the one that stings most. The Ford Ranger and the Ford Everest, 2 of the most successful vehicles Ford sells anywhere in the world, were designed in Australia. Vaughan's own account is that the territory taught them how to do it. They are built in Thailand. Now put the 2 halves of this together, because it is the arithmetic the whole argument rests on. Toyota Australia exported 1,324,991 vehicles. 1,245,000 of them went to the Middle East. Toyota's Australian plant sent more than 1 million cars overseas. Ford Australia exported almost none. Not because nobody wanted them, because Detroit said no. Twice, 20 years apart. Of the 7.5 million cars Holden built in this country, the overwhelming majority were sold within it. An industry that could never reach scale at home was forbidden from reaching it anywhere else. Consider what that means for a moment. 2 plants in the same country in the same decade making cars of comparable quality. One of them was allowed to sell to the world and shipped more than 1 million. The other was told it could not, and the people who told it were not Australian, and no Australian government could overrule them. That is the sharpest sense in which the word deliberate is earned in this story, not a conspiracy and not malice. A decision taken by named executives in a boardroom on another continent to protect their own plants at the expense of ours. Be fair to General Motors, because they did export. The Monaro went to America as the Pontiac GTO, about 31,500 of them. The Commodore followed as the Pontiac G8, around 41,000, and later as the Chevrolet SS, just under 13,000. Real cars, genuinely admired, and every one of them a niche run. The G8 died along with Pontiac in General Motors bankruptcy in 2009. Nice cars never scale, and there is a bitter footnote to the GTO. It was a genuinely quick, well-built coupe, and American reviewers liked it. What killed it was the styling. It looked, to American eyes, like an ordinary sedan with 2 doors, and Americans wanted a muscle car to look like one. Which raises the question this entire argument turns on, and it deserves the best answer anybody has. Chapter 9. What the wall paid for. Was it ever going to survive? Start with the case that it was not at full strength, because it is a serious case and leaving it out would be dishonest. Australians buy around 1 million cars a year, spread across dozens of brands and hundreds of models. A single modern plant needs about 250,000 units of a handful of models to be viable. At the end, Elizabeth was building roughly 400 cars a day and selling about 300, and the yard behind the plant was filling up with the difference. Falcon sales fell from 31,632 in 2008 to 14,345 in 2012. Ford's own assessment was that manufacturing here cost double what it cost in Europe and nearly 4 times what it cost in Asia. The mining boom took the Australian dollar to parity with the American dollar, and every export case in the country died with it. And the product was wrong. Australians moved to small cars and then to SUVs, and the industry kept building large rear-wheel drive sedans, because that is what the tooling made, and retooling costs more than anybody had. There is a fair answer to the product criticism too. The last Falcons and the last Commodores were good cars. The Barra 6 is admired internationally to this day, and used Barra engines are now shipped from Australia to North America by people who want them. The engineering was never the problem. The arithmetic was. Then there is the domino, and this part is documented rather than alleged. The 3 manufacturers shared a supplier base. When Ford announced its exit in May 2013, the volumes underneath the remaining 2 fell below what those suppliers needed to survive. Toyota's stated reason for leaving was that the parts makers would collapse without the others. 1 left, and all 3 had to. Now the finding, from the body that was asked to examine exactly this question. The Productivity Commission's inquiry report, handed down on the 31st of March 2014, put it in one sentence. Decades of transitional assistance to automotive manufacturing firms, $30 billion between 1997 and 2012, has forestalled, but not prevented, the significant structural adjustment now facing the industry. $30 billion over 15 years in tariffs and subsidies combined. So it was not a declaration in Peru. It was not the unions. It was not the men on the line at Elizabeth. $30 billion bought this industry time, and it never once bought it competitiveness. And the Commission said so in writing 7 weeks after the last company announced it was leaving. One thing about the workers, because it is documented and it is rarely said. In 2013, the union worked with Holden to shed 500 jobs and put a 3-year wage freeze to the workforce at Elizabeth to try to keep the plant open. They voted yes. General Motors closed it anyway. Both halves of that are true, and neither cancels the other. And on the 10th of December 2013, the Treasurer of Australia stood up in Parliament. Chapter 10. Either you're here or you're not. To understand what happened that afternoon, you have to understand how Joe Hockey worked. And the first thing to get right, because it is got wrong constantly, is his job. Hockey was the Treasurer. Matthias Cormann was the Finance Minister. They are different offices, and this was the Treasurer. Hockey's method was fiscal moralism delivered through independent findings. His slogan, from a speech in London in April 2012, was that the age of entitlement is over. His instruments were reviews, a commission of audit to build the case for cuts, a Productivity Commission inquiry into the car industry, whose finding of a weak policy rationale would provide the cover to withdraw. He did not usually announce a cut. He dared the other side into the open and let an independent report deliver the verdict. There is one detail about him worth knowing. His father was born in Bethlehem in 1927, and the family name, Hocadonian, was anglicised to Hockey in 1948 when his father reached Australia, the same year the first Holden came off the line at Fisherman's Bend. Tony Abbott had gone to the September 2013 election promising to cut $500 million from industry assistance, and had said the previous week that there would be no more taxpayer money. On the 10th of December 2013, Holden's Managing Director Mike Devereaux told the Productivity Commission that no decision had been made. Hours later, Hockey rose in the House of Representatives. He said Holden should come clean with the Australian people, that it should be fair dinkum. And then came the sentence that has followed him ever since. Either you're here or you're not. Holden announced its closure the next day. Ford had already announced in May. Toyota followed in February 2014 and said plainly that it was going because the others had gone. Whether that sentence in the House caused the closure or merely dated it is the argument people have been having ever since, and it will not be settled here. What is not in dispute is the sequence. A treasurer demanded an answer on a Tuesday and got one on a Wednesday, and the company was gone. Friday, the 20th of October, 2017, 11:45 in the morning. Elizabeth. The car park is full again, and the cars in it are Toranas and Monaros and Kingswoods, and this time their owners have driven them here to stand at the fence. Around 950 people are working their last shift. Some of them are the sons of men who worked the shift in 1970, in the same building, on the same ground, and a few of them are the grandsons. One of them, a worker named Alex Kyriakopoulos, buys the last car the plant ever framed up and painted, and keeps it. A red Commodore comes off the line and stops, and this time somebody writes the number down. 7,687,675 Holdens, and that is the last of them. Years later, a strategic analyst named Graham Doble put the whole thing in a single observation. A country now committing hundreds of billions of dollars to sovereign defence capability had, a decade earlier, refused to find between $150 and $250 million to keep its last two car makers running to 2022. In today's sovereign capability era, he wrote, Canberra would be hugging the final two car makers, not hissing them out the door. Built as a defence asset, kept alive as a jobs program, killed as a budget line. Three different arguments for the same factory across 70 years, and the last one won. Now, the part that is not grief. Ford never actually left. Around 1,500 people still work in automotive research and development in this country, including more than 1,000 designers and engineers. And they are the people who designed the Ranger that the world drives. A firm called Premcar Engineers, Nissan's Warrior, utes out of Melbourne. Walkinshaw converts American pickups to right-hand drive with 1,200 staff. Altona makes hydrogen where it made Camrys. Tonsley is a university precinct. And be honest about the men and women themselves in both directions. A year after the closures, more than 80% of the Holden workers had found other work. 2 years after, a union survey found that fewer than 5% of them were in jobs as good as the ones they had lost. The last car sits on a plinth at the National Motor Museum at Birdwood, under lights, with its number printed on a card beside it. The town outside it is still there. Elizabeth was built for the plant, and the plant is gone. And what has happened to those streets since is its own long story that this is not the place for. Nobody on the line at Elizabeth in 1970 ever wrote a number down. They thought there would always be another one.